They laughed when she got dumped. They laughed until the chandeliers seemed to shake with the sound of it, until champagne stopped daring to sparkle and flattened into a dozen awkward, sticky puddles on the polished floor. Cameras swiveled, phones rose like an accusing chorus, and in the center of the room, Stella stood with a smile that fractured the moment her name fell from Ian's mouth like ash. It was supposed to be a celebration. The banquet hall at the Sterling Pavilion had been lit like a small sun. Gilded drapes, a string quartet in a corner, platters of artful hors d'oeuvres circulating through clusters of guests who belonged to one family's orbit or another. Somewhere between the second speech and Ian's intended toast, a video began to slide across the screens people held up, an anonymous whisper that became a headline. Ian had a child. Ian had been seeing someone else. Ian, who had just kissed Stella on stage, was now saying, with a casualness that made the room tilt, that he could no longer go through with the marriage. The first laugh was a sound of release, nervous, brittle. Then the real laughter arrived, bright, sharp, cruel. It rolled over Stella like cold water. Faces she expected loyalty from blinked, turned away, or leaned forward to gossip. Her mother's hand, which had been on her shoulder when she walked in, retreated as though burned. A cousin she'd grown up playing dolls with smiled and pulled her own daughter closer, as if Stella were contagious. "Is this a joke?" someone whispered. Phones angled. Close-ups of Stella's stunned face flickered across social feeds. The hashtag bloomed within minutes. Hashtag Sterling Scandal, like a bruise. Clips of the moment Ian's voice broke, of Stella's dress catching light, were spliced with smug commentary from late-night stylists and opportunistic influencers. The banquet, meant to crown a future, became a live-streamed tragedy. Stella felt each ripple of laughter as a physical thing. Her hands went cold. She could have fallen to pieces. She could have begged, cried, explained. For a heartbeat, that list of possible reactions swam through her mind like a tide of small, dark things. Instead, she did the only thing that felt clean. She straightened. She let the silence that followed Ian's words stretch. "Thank you," she said, not looking at him, but at the people gathered. Her voice, when it came, surprised her. Steady, too small for the room, but perfectly clear. "If anyone here thinks my worth is tied to a contract, you're welcome to keep your congratulations." She smiled, no false sweetness, no plea for pity, and turned away. A dozen smartphones recorded the sour half-smile that became a frozen image across the internet. They posted it with captions that aimed to wound and went viral because the world loves a spectacle. They wrote that she had been a social climber, a gold digger, a mistake. They forgot to remember the night she had spent stitching invitations by hand when there wasn't a wedding planner in sight. The way she had turned down an offer to disappear quietly. The work she did to keep appearances unbroken for the family that raised her. When the playlist on someone's phone switched to a newsfeed, the tone of the room changed yet again. The Sterling family publicist stepped forward, apologizing with the practiced ease of someone whose life had long been dedicated to smoothing over cracks that could end in ruin. Offstage, the whispers became an orchestrated narrative that Ian had been a victim of deceit, that Stella had been dishonest. A smear campaign breathed into being as if by the blink of an editor's eye. By the time Stella reached the valet, the cold outside wrapped around her like judgment. People watched her go, leaning back in their seats to have a better look, as though she were an exhibit. On the curb, a cluster of teenagers who had been at the party exhaled in relief, their phones alight with offers of mockery. One of them tossed a crumpled napkin at Stella's heels. It slapped against the hem of her dress and fluttered to the gutter. She did not pick it up. She had been careful all her life, careful with every word, every step, every borrowed smile. She had been careful at the Sterling mansion, where the staff treated her like a guest and the family treated her with a polite distance. She had been careful with Ian, who seemed to like her because she moved easily in rooms where he felt comfortable. Careful had been her armor. That evening, armor felt useless. When she finally let herself into the taxi and watched the Sterling lights recede through the rain-slabbed window, the laughter still threaded in her ears. The video would be everywhere by morning. Her phone vibrated, a low, incessant throb. Messages stacked, concise cruelty, curious questions, and a few that aimed to be kind but felt like distance. She told the driver an address that was not the villa she had once called home. She had been preparing, in the small hours before the engagement announcement, for a life of deferred comforts and polite dinners. She had not been preparing for ridicule and public shaming. The taxi hummed on. Through the glass, city lights smeared and blurred. Stella pressed a palm to the cool pane and let herself breathe. If you're hooked by Stella's comeback, hit like and subscribe. If the line she spoke at the banquet had been an act of defiance, the morning that followed sharpened it into a new kind of resolve. Social feeds bloomed into an early morning storm, editorials, snappy captioned photos, conspiratorial threads. The narrative spun, and some parts of it cut deeper than anyone could have expected. The family card she used for expenses was disabled by a voice she'd thought was on her side. The business lines that she'd relied on for intimate favors were closed under family precaution. Invitations were rescinded. A couture house refused to take back a dress once it learned of the scandal. Someone in the family had called the bank and put her on a hold. Someone else had whispered to the press that her place at the manor had always been conditional. She could have slunk away. She chose, instead, to go back. Stella went to the small apartment that had been hers before the Sterling circle had felt like a promise. It was the city's quieter quarter, book-lined cafes, vinyl shops, and a florist with no pretense. The apartment had a chipped sink and a balcony that caught the evening sun. It also had a rusted key to a life she had once lived with a gentleness it now felt almost sacrilegious to remember. She sat on the edge of a narrow couch and let the silence braid her thoughts into a single knot. She replayed Ian's face. There had been a tremor in his jaw when he said the words. She wondered if he had been convinced by something or someone else. She remembered Yvette Liang, whose smile could fold like a blade. Yvette, Nanny's daughter, raised as the family's darling, had always moved in rooms like a question intended to unsettle others. Susan Liu, whose laugh could curdle into glee, had always favored Yvette with the kind of devotion that doesn't ask why. Their presence at the banquet had been like a pair of addled suns, whose light warmed only them. Then there was Ronan. He had been in the room that night, as he always was in the margins where the family's decisions felt quiet and dangerous. He had watched from a place that was private as a closed fist. Ronan Shao, as the papers called him in the breathless covers of profile pieces, was the kind of man who carried power with the ease of someone who'd never needed to prove he had it. He was an heir, yes, but also someone who treated loyalty like a currency he spent rarely and carefully. He had grown up alongside Stella, the two of them kids running in the service corridors of the manor until the world of adult politics taught them the shape of danger. They had been raised like siblings in a household that took them in, but whispers always said they were not blood. Ronan's face, when it registered indignation that night, was not the face of a brother in pain. It was something fiercer, protective, precise, the look of someone who kept a map of every wrong the world had ever tried to press into place on the people he cared about. She could have called him then. She did not. She had always been careful about taking help that felt like it asked for submission. The boutique incident happened 2 days after the banquet, after the hashtag had settled into a permanent place on the trending column. Stella had gone to exchange the dress, or at least to get credit, for a garment that in another life would have been a small, meaningless luxury. The sales associate had peered at her with polite suspicion. A woman in pearls at the register, A guest, whose face had been in the viral footage the night before, had made a show of looking Stella up and down. A chorus of small slights gathered like rain clouds. "Is this the woman?" someone murmured. A clerk, flushed with the taste of being part of a story, suggested with a smile that sounded like a judge's gavel that Stella's dress might be counterfeit. The words were meant to humiliate. They did. When Stella's card was declined at the boutique, another administrative mercy from someone with access and a decision to ruin, she did not cry. She left the dress on the counter and walked out while the woman in pearls trilled something about karma and clicked her heels together for a photograph. Outside, a driver for a luxury car idled by the curb, and a cluster of socialites peered over their phones. The city, which until then had seemed to care about appearances, decided that Stella's fall was a topic worthy of conversation. That night, the birthday party, another family affair, became a stage for small cruelties. Someone had arranged a tableau of old photos, Stella's childhood smiles, edited and arranged as if she were a rescued orphan in a family album where she had never quite belonged. A cousin recited her memories with the exaggerated fondness of someone rehearsing pity. "You always were so theatrical, Stella," Yvette said, voice smooth as satin. The smile clung like a mask. "We were so worried about what you might do." Stella felt the room tilt again, like someone turning a dial. Then, startling even herself, she stood up. The music, plaintive, embarrassed strings, fell away in the tense air. "I will not sit through your pity," she said. The words cut the small pleasures of the moment into halves. "Nor will I sit for lies. If you have something to say about me, say it now. I refuse to be humiliated in silence." There was the sound of forks being set down. Ian's face, at the edge of the table, manifested a shadow of guilt and confusion. He had been coaxed, persuaded. There were men in tailored suits who cared more about paper than people, and women who had learned to manipulate the world like chess, and sometimes the pieces were other people's lives. Stella did not have the privilege of seeing the conversations behind doors. She only had the present, and in it she chose to stand. Afterward, she packed a small suitcase and left the villa. She was not evicted with a single letter, but the shift was slow and efficient. A maid who no longer acknowledged her by name, a lawyer who sent a terse note about arrangements. Her card stopped working completely. The house where she had been permitted to stay became a place of dimmed lamps and polite distance. She did not beg. She did not plead. She sold the rings she had been given as a child, cheap trinkets that meant nothing to a family that had made them gestures, and bought a small, shabby key to an apartment whose landlord did not care about names that mattered, and which did not ask for explanations in exchange for a roof. The next morning, while social feeds still echoed with the banquet's aftermath, people walked their dogs and went to work and glided past flattering storefront windows. The city kept breathing. Then, in a single heartbeat, the tide turned. It started with a photograph. Two hands, clasped, stepping from the back seat of a black car that had the kind of understated sheen only the very wealthy could preserve. The image was simple, two hands in the act of finding one another, but the world read it like a proclamation. Ronan's fingers were large and warm. Stella's hand rested in his as though it had belonged there all along. The angle of the light caught an engagement ring that had once been celebrated in a roster of family photos, now shining like a beacon. By noon, the photograph had been dissected, annotated, and outraged. Everyone had an opinion. The people who had laughed at the banquet were suddenly quiet. Their laughter, caught in yesterday's echo, felt like a liability. Influencers made quick edits from shock to remorse, or from gossips to mouthpieces of further suspicion. The narrative bent under the weight of the new image, not a woman abandoned, but a woman chosen by the man everyone assumed was a recluse in the family's higher circles. The day was raw with contrast. Stella, who had spent the morning straightening a small apartment, went to step out when a soft knock sounded at her door. She had learned to expect calls from strangers or the click of messages, not the steady, polite cadence that had been a habit of Ronan's for years. When she opened the door, he stood there as if he had been waiting outside for an age. Tailored coat, hair deliberately untamed, the expression on his face a mixture of controlled outrage and tender concern. "You could have called," she told him, and for the first time in a while, the words came without armor. He lifted his hand. "I prefer to see things with my own eyes." She wanted to ask him why he had come now, why he had chosen to stand with her in public before she had decided to pick up the pieces. She wanted to say he was making everything more complicated. Instead, she let him close the door behind him. Outside, cameras blinked. A paparazzo, waiting for the right angle, caught the moment Ronan took her hand and led her to the car. It became the photograph the next morning. Ronan Kiao and Stella Kiao. People misread, people opined, holding hands. The image was designed to be remembered. People who had speculated on Stella's shortcomings were confronted with a new image of dignity. The internet, which had been busy inventing a story of failure, found itself turning its attention to questions of loyalty and power. If one family's narrative had turned on her humiliation, another's power, Ronan's quiet, inexorable authority, reclaimed the stage. They traveled to Orchid Manor, a place whose name suggested delicate beauty and, once crossed, an invisible perimeter of protection. The manor towered in an old neighborhood like a dark promise. Formal gardens, a staff whose loyalty was not for hire, and a man who moved within its walls like a conductor. Leo, the house's butler, stooped in age but precise in his gestures, opened the door with a look that said, "Business first, sentiment later." "You look like you could use a cup of something hot," he said, as if commenting on the weather rather than a recent scandal that had broken the internet. Ronan's touch on her hand felt like an anchor. In the house, the lights softened against carved wood and muted tapestries. He guided her toward a sitting room where the world, for the first time in a week, felt careful and considered rather than raw and predatory. "You don't have to explain anything to me," he said quietly. "But if you want to, I'll listen." Stella looked at him. There was history in the way they fit together. Years of shared moments that were never pronounced, but always present. Ronan had been a presence in her life like a lighthouse, steadier than love or family loyalty, and for that reason, his arrival in public felt like a declaration that could not be taken back. He did not parade her, he did not demand anything of her. He simply offered space. "Why now?" she asked. "Why hold my hand like that when the world is watching?" He smiled almost without humor. "Because the world has been watching for a while, and because sometimes the world needs to see that someone refuses to let it write the wrong stories about people he cares for." It was not a dramatic speech. It was the kind of statement that carried the weight of someone used to moving pieces behind the scenes. Yet for Stella it was radical, not rescue as spectacle, but rescue as stubborn, quiet protection. The media scrambled for explanations. The speculative columns tried to map family alliances. Some wrote that Ronan had simply always loved a good fight. Others suggested he had invested in a public relations coup. Whatever the spin, the effect was immediate. The number of comments that traded in cruelty dropped, replaced by a fresh wave of curiosity. Who was Ronan really? Was he, perhaps, the kind of man who would not allow a lie to stand? At lunch, behind the set of manicured hedges in the manor's walled garden, Ronan asked simple questions. How she'd slept, whether she had eaten. He asked gently. Those questions were care disguised as small domesticities. Stella, who had spent days holding grief and humiliation like something hot against her ribs, answered. "I don't know why they were so quick to believe lies," she said, voice low. "I suppose it's easier to carve a story than to look for reasons." He watched her, like someone marking the shape of a map he'd had since childhood. Ronan grew quieter when he thought. He had the kind of presence that made silence feel like a considered thing rather than an absence. "People will try to control the story," he said. "They'll choose versions that benefit them, but stories can be corrected." They were interrupted by a text that arrived on Ronan's phone, a short, curt message from Leo about a matter that required security. Ronan's jaw tightened for half a second. Not long after, a staff member showed him a forwarded thread, a private message containing a rumor about Stella, something malicious and precise, styled to wound. "You'll have to be patient," Ronan said, not to Stella, but as if to the world. "We'll sort this." Stella felt suddenly industrious. It had surprised her the way indignation could be shaped into action. She began, insistently, to gather facts. She asked for the banquet footage, for the original video that had been uploaded. She traced the edits and found, layer by layer, how the narrative had been altered. In the dressing room footage, someone had cut a few seconds that had made Ian look as if he were withdrawing, while, unseen, the real conversation had been more complicated. Someone had slipped in a shot from a different party, a different week, and overlaid it with suggestive captions. She began to see how the story had been constructed, as if a set of hands had been stitching a suit from other people's memories. Ronan watched her assembling the pieces the way he watched maps unfold. He offered legal contacts, small staffs that could find the original files, and people who could identify the accounts that had released the video. He gave her time and a kind of siege-proofed privacy. No more giveaways in the press, no more unsolicited commentary from friends. But protection carried its own dangers. Susan Liu, watching from behind her screens, did not like being countered. She had benefited once her scheme, subtler than a flat-out betrayal, necessary, in her mind, to keep the family's lineage untangled, was in motion. Yvette, whose smile had the lethal friendliness of a blade, was not a woman who relinquished her props easily. The next beat from the other side of the city was not a polite word, but a threat. Ronan called up a list of his own allies. He shared confidential contacts, private investigators, a legal team that had untangled worse than social smear campaigns. He instructed Leo to mark the entrances to the manor and to confirm that the staff knew what to do if things escalated. This swarm of useful people moved quietly, the way a storm gathers. And then the threats grew fingers. A menacing voicemail landed at Stella's old apartment address, where a friend checked mail out of habit. The tinny recording was a man's voice, low, bland, and patient, saying things about family heirlooms and debts, asking pointed questions about who had the right to certain items that were whispered to be priceless. In the background, static, a phone being pressed to a palm until the sound filled the line and turned a threat into an offer. Return the heirloom and the family would be spared scandal. Stella's blood turned cold on a detail. The voice used a nickname she had only ever heard in one room. The name connected to an heirloom that the family kept like a story everyone gave the same ending to. Someone who knew the private vocabulary had called to make a demand. Threats about objects were threats about lineage, about who owned history. She looked at Ronan, who had been listening without flinching. "They're trying to use the past as a weapon," she said. "They think if they can pull at that thread, the whole thing will unravel." He folded his hands. "Then we make sure they don't pull anything. We protect what's ours and, if necessary, we expose who tries to take it." The word ours landed with complexities. Ronan spoke it, and the air shifted. It was not a claim of ownership so much as a promise. For Stella, who had been taught to measure herself against the family's slightest inclinations, the inclusion felt like an invitation. That night, when the manor settled into its quiet, a hush of servants' footsteps and the distant tick of clocks, Stella sat by a window and watched the city lights blur into lines. Her phone lit with a dozen accounts, messages from distant friends, emails from editors asking for statements, a thin thread of private messages that suggested congratulations couched in curiosity. Somewhere beyond the walls, Yvette's laugh would be replaying for her own amusement. The world that had laughed at her felt relentless, as if it consumed whatever it saw. She wrapped her hands around a mug and thought of the photograph that had shifted everything. A simple clasp, a mutual consent of fingers. The image brought with it a taste of possibility. Yet danger had edges. The threat message mattered because it revealed that what had been a smear could metastasize into something more violent, something that traded intangible objects and the power to hold them. Stella's mind, trained by weeks of being vilified into being precise about what could be proved, began to plan. She would not let the family's narrative be rewritten by people who had learned to use rumor like currency. She would not sit back and be reduced to a caricature. She began to make a list, light on paper, heavy in intention. Original banquet footage, witness statements, the receipt for the dress, the truth about who had tried to use her card. She would gather everything. She had, suddenly, a reason to keep moving. Outside the manor, in the alleys that curved away from polished lawns, Shan Sheng sat in a low-lit room surrounded by the small, dangerous men who had answered his summons. He was not a man of ceremony or public clap. He dealt in bargaining chips, power secured by fear. Shan's family had once been a force of its own, and its decline had left him sharp and resentful. He listened as a young conspirator outlined the idea, a way to pressure the Sterling family by making the heirloom the fulcrum, by showing that their guardianship was not absolute. If Stella could be used as a bargaining chip, if the family's vulnerabilities could be exposed, then he could leverage the scandal to regain some of his own lost influence. "It's clean," the man said. "We take something, we demand a price. They pay. Or we make them bend." Shan's eyes slid to the photograph of Ronan and Stella that had been tacked to the wall, the public record of their hand-in-hand walk. He thought of the Chow family's power, the bluntness of money, and the soft spots no vault could secure. People. "If they think he'll go to war over a woman, they're right," he said. The tone was not tenderness, it was calculation. He did not see the tenderness in Ronan's grip. He only saw the chance to make the family's rosiest uniform show fray in public. Back at the manor, Ronan watched the security footage of the day's arrivals and departures with an attention that turned the images into a map. He listened to Leo's cataloging of deliveries and private guests. He marked names he wanted run through checks. He did not speak often. He preferred action. The first order was measured, practical, to identify who in the banquet footage had been positioned to influence narratives. The second was more personal. He asked Stella if she wanted to give a statement to the press. She hesitated. It felt tempting to let the world make amends publicly, to have cameras say her name with kindness. She thought of the small list in her pocket, proofs, receipts, an unstable ledger that would not be coherent unless someone sat down and put the pieces together. Exposure could save her reputation, but it could also magnify the risk that those who wanted to hurt her would only sharpen their methods. "I want to expose them," she said slowly, "but only if it stops at the truth. I don't want revenge staged as justice." Ronan's gaze warmed. "We'll show the truth. We'll not be cheap about it." He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent a life exercising influence without fanfare. It was reassuring. Yet the incoming threat, Shan's move, hung like a storm cloud whose light had not yet struck. The manor hummed with preparation. Leo checked doors, the legal team opened files, and a quiet sense of war-set timing settled over the place. That night, as rain stitched small rivers down the manor's wide windows, Stella dreamed of a banquet hall full of laughing faces whose mouths turned to stone as she crossed the floor with Ronan's hand in hers. The dream ended in a door being closed, a firm, final click. She woke with the sound echoing until it braided with the real world's new noises. A van idling beyond the hedges, a whisper from one of the staff that something had been seen moving near the service entrance. She wrapped her robe tight and went downstairs to find Ronan standing by the garden, the night air cooling his coat, hands in his pockets. They stood there for a long time looking at the moonlit hedges. "We might have just bought them a new reason to act," she said. "Then we make sure they regret it," he replied. It was not a promise of violence. It was a promise that if someone tried to make her into a pawn, they would find themselves playing a game with someone who refused to lose. The two of them walked back to the house together, their hands brushing, an echo of the picture that had reset public opinion. Inside, the manor moved around them like a living thing, breathing steady and sure. But beyond its walls, the air was thick with plots and small, restless men sharpening knives for a possibility none of them could be certain they would win. And somewhere in the city, a black van idled with its back door open, a crate waiting in its hold, and a voice recorded the family's name as if cataloging items in an estate sale. The plan, fragile and dangerous, was being set into motion, a detail that would not be revealed for days, perhaps. At Orchid Manor, Ronan shut the study door and pulled a file from a hidden drawer. He set it between them and slid a photograph across the polished surface. An image of the heirloom Stella had only ever seen in fragmented family memories. Stella leaned forward and touched the picture. Her fingers traced the edges like a map. The thing that had once been a symbol of legacy was now the very thing that might be used to blackmail, to humiliate, to reassert power. She felt its weight in that corner of paper as if it were physical. "We'll keep it safe," Ronan said. They both understood that to keep something safe meant to make choices that would mark them both. The world outside would try to take the image of two hands and turn it into a weapon. Inside the manor, they would take it and make it into a shield. When Stella stood at the large window and watched the clouds slide across the moon, the city below felt like a chessboard. People were already placing their bets. She had, this far, reclaimed the single thing that mattered most to her, the ability to choose how she would be seen. She had Ronan's quiet, immense hand at the base of her courage. She had her feet, which refused to step backward. Somewhere in the dark, men were planning to take what they thought would break a family. Stella counted names like a litany and placed them in the box of things she would answer. She would not be dragged into the roles that others had penned for her. She would not be a cautionary tale in a world that loved spectacle. The night deepened. The house was a pocket of light. Outside, the world murmured and scratched at its own stories. In the quiet before the storm struck, Stella placed her hand over Ronan's across the photograph. It was small, an echo of that morning's public grasp, but private, warm, and consenting. "We'll be careful," she said. "We will be," he answered. They had not yet spoken the words one would call love, not in the way that binds a promise into law. What they had was steadiness, two people who had watched parts of each other be toyed with and had chosen to stand in the same light. Outside, a van pulled away with an empty promise, and a man in its backfield smiled because he had been hired to believe in the power of fear. Inside, Ronan and Stella drew the curtains and prepared the house for visitors that would not be polite. The next morning, the photograph of their hands would eclipse last week's scandal in the feeds. People would blink and adjust their opinions. But the small danger that hummed like a wasp near the window remained unspun, waiting. And in the quiet of the manor's library, a recorder that had been recording a dozen names in different rooms would be played later in a voice that might change everything. Stella made herself a promise in that dim library, by a lamp whose light threw the pile of papers into sharp shadows. She would not be reduced, and she would not be rescued into silence. If someone tried to buy off her destiny with fear, she would take the evidence and place it where it could be seen. She would not be a showpiece beside a powerful man. She would be equal, vigilant, and present. Outside the manor gates, a shadow moved between hedges. It paused as if listening, then continued along the service road. In the distance, an engine rumbled like a threat turned into a vehicle. Inside, Ronan closed the file and looked at Stella, the corner of his mouth honest in a way that no headline could ever capture. "We'll handle them," he said. She met his gaze, feeling the long road of what had to happen stretching out ahead of them like a map of both danger and possible redemption. "Together," she answered. They did not yet know the shape the danger would take. They only had the certainty of intent and the echo of a photograph that would change public opinion for a day, and perhaps, if they were clever, forever. A week later, an unmarked message would arrive at the manor. Just a scroll of typed words and a single photograph of an empty pedestal where the heirloom once sat. The sender's identity was blank. The threat was thin as paper and heavy as a fist. It read, "Return what is ours, or the next thing you love will be taken from you." Ronan folded the paper, his face hardening. Stella felt her breath leave her for a moment, and then come back in a steady, obedient cadence. "Then we prepare," she said. They began, with method and care, to collect each fragment of proof they could find. The rules of the fight were invisible and unspoken, but they were understood. Protection required more than security checks. It required laying out the truth like a net. Outside, the city continued to spin its dramas. People continued to laugh, or scorn, or sympathize. Inside the manor's walls, two hands rested together on a table, and in the space between them a plan formed. Small acts of intelligence, a gathering of allies, a refusal to allow humiliation to be the final word. A plan that would change everything if they succeeded. A plan that might cost them both. The photograph that had once repaired her reputation now became a target. The choice to stand together had made them both visible. They did not yet know how far the danger would reach, only that it had teeth. And somewhere in the night, a crate moved under the careful eye of men whose pockets had been paid to believe there would be no consequence. The line had been drawn. A crate moved under the cover of night, a shadow slipping between the trimmed hedges like a thought that wanted no witness. Shan Sheng's men were efficient in their brutality. No melodrama, only a clean, professional capacity for making things disappear. They thought the manor's defenses could be outflanked by speed and secrecy, by the right bribe at the right moment. They knew the stakes: family heirlooms, reputations, leverage. They did not expect a woman who had spent the last week counting evidence and learning how to turn gossip into ammunition. Stella woke to quiet at first, the house humming with normalcy, the kind of normal that felt like armor. She had not slept well. The ember of danger had become a constant light at the edge of her thoughts. She dressed in a sweater and jeans, kept her hair loose in a way that suggested a tired domesticity, and carried a small leather pouch that had nothing glamorous inside: a pen, a tangled receipt, and an odd little pendant Ronan had pressed into her hand the night before. He had called it a precaution. She had called it dignity. It was a tiny tracker with a simple activation, given with the insistence of someone who refused to leave things to chance. She should not have been surprised when the alarms went off. What took her by surprise was the way the noise felt immediate and intimate, less like a blaring siren and more like a personal accusation. Leo's voice crackled through the manor's halls. Doors were secure, he said. Someone had tripped the back gate. Security lights flashed. Bushes rustled outside. Stella did what she had learned to do in the last weeks. She moved towards the source of information. She had an instinct for the kind of small details that took larger systems apart: an odd shoe track in the gravel, a cigarette butt behind a discarded delivery box, the way the gardener's dog had barked at midnight. She walked toward the service entrance where the hedges made a private corridor and found an open door, a thin smear of black on the stone where someone had slid a crate out. She almost laughed at how ordinary the entry was. The world uses the mundane to mask violence. And then a hand was clamped over her mouth. The voice in her ear was not rough, it was businesslike. "Quiet," someone said. "No one needs to get hurt." Her heart moved like an animal pushed into a corner, and then, Because she had been practicing how to be a person who answered instead of being answered, she did not freeze. Her fingers, still in the leather pouch, closed around the pendant. She had argued against Ronan's protective instincts before, had resisted being made into someone who needed a map to walk home. But prudence is not the same as shame. She had accepted the pendant because she did not want her life to hinge on an accident of misfortune. When the captors, 2 men in black, faces half covered, dragged her toward the van, she let them think they had her. Then she pressed the pendant's small button with her thumb and tucked it deep into her pocket. It was the sort of small act no one saw as heroic, but which might be the difference between being spoken of and being counted among the missing. The ride was short and bumpy. The men argued, small human things, plans to fence whatever they could find, promises of payment. They laughed at what they thought was easy money. Stella learned their voices like maps, mapping inflections and tracing resentments. She listened for Sean's voice, the one name that hung in rumors and fear. It never came directly, only through the radio crackle and a clipped command here or there. She kept her face blank. She made the mistake they expected of someone they thought was frightened. She smiled when forced. The van stopped in a warehouse district that smelled of oil and stale cardboard. Lights were red, and the men unloaded crates with the practiced motion of people who did the same thing to the same things until their hands forgot how to be gentle. Stella was pushed into a small office in the back. She found herself against a wall lined with old invoices and faded shipping labels. The man left her alone for a time, confident in their plan. Alone, she reached into her pocket. The pendant's faint ping, barely a hum, was active. She pressed it to the base of her throat, feeling its cool metal against her skin. It was something Ronan had insisted she carried, not a symbol of ownership, but a practical tool. She opened the small leather pouch again and pulled out the receipts she'd kept, the tiny photograph of the heirloom she'd traced with a careful finger, and the paper where she had been recording edits and timestamps she'd found in the banquet footage. She rearranged the papers into a single stack, the way one organizes evidence into a narrative. The men returned. One of them left a radio on the desk, a constant background noise of static and the occasional clipped instruction. She listened closer as they spoke in low voices, and then one of them laughed and repeated a name, Yvette, in a tone that treated conspiracy like a currency. "Money's in the account," the man said. "Boss will get his cut. Someone's paying for this to look shining." "Right," said the other. "Once we have the thing, we put the heat on the family. They'll pay." They were sloppy. Sloppiness is a kindness to anyone with the patience to listen. Stella leaned forward and let her ear brush the paper of the desk as if she were simply inspecting the room. From the table drawer, a blue pen fell out and rolled until it bumped her shoe. She bent and picked it up, noticing the logo stamped on the side, an address to a storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Her heart did not race. It worked in a different register. She cataloged instead of panicked. Storage facility name, delivery code, a time mentioned by one of the men, midnight. She whispered their words into a small recorder she had secreted in her sleeve. It was a little thing, an unremarkable piece of plastic she had kept from an old phone. It recorded breath and argument with the uninterpreting fidelity of a machine. She took a breath and signed her name onto a scrap of paper, Stella Chow, and sat very still, knowing the pendant's beacon would reach Ronan, knowing that the man who loves maps would find the line between point A and point B. But it would not be simple. Sean's men moved the crates in a hurry and saw her watching. One shoved a hard shoulder into her ribs. She swore and moved, shifting position so that when they dragged her into a storage corridor, she left a small smear of red on the rough wood. She did not have to make a scene. The smear would be a mark, a letter left on a page for someone who knew how to read it. The men laughed about the money they would make. One of them, impatient, left the office door propped open. The pendant's hum carried out the roof like a breadcrumb trail. Ronan's security feed had registered the van's license as it had skirted cameras around the manor, a partial plate that the system had been able to patch.
Leo had seen the shadow at the back gate on his night rounds. When the pendant's signal pinged on Ronan's phone, the map formed like a promise. He did not hesitate. He called the legal team. He called in a private tactician he trusted who still answered because Chow calls have weight. He called the police with as much calm as a man can wield before the world he loves is in danger.
"They took her," he said, and his voice carried the kind of concentrated anger that is less a shout than an ordered storm. "Trace the signal. Put a patrol on the outer roads. We have coordinates, but move fast." The rescue that followed had the gross edges of a controlled professional raid. Lights, a van of uniformed officers, the almost cozy smell of adrenaline and coffee. But it was foliated with human worry. Leo rode near the front with the legal team, the private tactician at his elbow like an anxious ghost of strategy. Ronan stood at the back, quiet and precise, the sort of person who could look at a plan and see where the fewest lives would be risked. At the warehouse, they moved like a practice team. Officers fanned out. Ronan and a small tactical unit edged to a side entrance. The men inside were startled by the sudden noise, the shuddering weight of authority. There was confusion, the flash of a knife that never quite found a hand, a man stumbling into a stack of crates. In the chaos, Stella slipped forward. She had learned, in the weeks of humiliation and slow gathering of facts, to be small and sudden at once. She found an exit route behind a pallet of empty boxes and pushed at it, listening for the bootsteps of her captors. She pressed her ear to the cool metal and heard the voices on the other side, one of them arguing about payment, the other muttering, bored. She heard the clink of keys and the rustle of paper. She clicked her recorder on and let it track the details of the men's conversation while she eased the latch. The metal squealed faintly, and she froze. On the other side of the door, lights strobed, officers shouted, and the men scrambled like rooks from a board. A shot fired, not into a body, but into the air, a warning that counted as bravado. Then a hand clamped on her wrist from the inside, a rough man who swore and pulled. Stella did two things at once. She kicked her heel back at his knee, hard, relying on a motion she had practiced in self-defense classes when feeling powerless had been a luxury she could no longer afford. The man cursed and bent. She twisted, moving in a brief, necessary choreography that threw the man off balance and allowed her to dart into the corridor. She found herself in the arms of a uniformed officer a heartbeat later, safety and protocol in a single motion. Outside, Ronan watched her being escorted across the asphalt, the lights turning the scene into a painting of chaos and order. He wanted to hold her and not let go. Instead, in front of cameras and officers, he did the most humane thing a man with power can do. He let the law do its work and then stepped in to check the details. The warehouse emptied into cuffs and statements. Sean's men were hauled into vans. The heirloom, wrapped in coarse cloth, was found under a tarp in a corner, slightly scratched but intact. Stella sat on the tailgate of a police car and breathed until the world slowed around her. She had been frightened. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She recounted the slurs and laughter she had heard. She handed over the recorder. She had something else as well. A photograph she had found in a man's wallet during the scuffle, a glossy print of Susan Liu and a numbered invoice to Sean's account. The paper's edges were rough, the handwriting was neat. "You heard them talk about money," the lead detective said. His voice had the firm tilt of someone who believed in paperwork and justice enough to follow both. "I did," Stella said, "and I heard names. I heard the word account and a transfer number." She handed the detective the pen with the storage facility logo she had picked up earlier. "This was on the desk. I kept it." Evidence stacked like tidy bricks. The pendant's trail, the recorder's file detailing men talking about payoffs, the photograph showing Susan's name and an invoice. Ronan's legal team lifted banking records. A trail, small, human, and precise, glowed like a map of culpability. The officer who had a background in financial crime squinted and connected the invoice number to a shell account. one that had been fed by a series of transfers from a private account linked to a consulting firm Susan Liu controlled. They had thought secrecy, and what they had built was only as strong as the people who could be trusted to keep it. Greed makes the most trustworthy people careless. News moved differently now. Stories that had been salacious gossip had to be rewritten with facts. The social feeds that had once laughed now moved to careful headlines about arrests and charges. The leak of the photograph of Ronan and Stella had, earlier, forced a reevaluation of how quickly opinions formed. Now, with the capture and the evidence, a new narrative had to be stitched. There was anger in the manor that morning, an old, practical anger that wants legal recourse and public acknowledgement. Ronan briefed the press with a control that kept the story focused on the reality of the crime. The heirloom had been stolen, people had been paid to make the theft happen, and significant questions were now pointed in certain directions. He did not fling his power like a sword, he held it like a steadying hand. Yvette's name surfaced in statements. The detective produced the photo of Susan's supposed invoice and the ledger entries that matched transfers into Sean's account. There was a photograph as well, a screenshot of Yvette and an unknown man exchanging numbers in a coffee shop on a night the prosecution later tied to a wire transfer. Yvette, when confronted, went pale. There is a moment in scandals where the first falsehood collapses. The debris falls on those who built the lie and those who believed it. But the key moment, the one that moved the scandal from rumor into culpability, came from a place Stella had not expected to reach on her own. In the back of one of Sean's men's shirts, Leo found a stub of a receipt from a medical center and a paper with a doctor's name. Leo had been methodical in his search after the raid, and the butler's old hands, trained to find things others missed, had located the small slip. It was a red thread leading to a damning piece of proof. The doctor, when called, did not want scandal. He wanted the world to be a place where records meant something. When Ronan's legal team presented the receipt, the doctor admitted, reluctantly, that a patient's ultrasound image had been obtained from an unrelated file and printed out. An image reused, mislabeled, and then handed over to someone who would present it as evidence of pregnancy. Medical records do not exist to be forged without leaving a warp in the weave. The doctor produced patient logs that demonstrated the file belonged to another patient entirely and had been printed the day before as part of an office admin error, not a personal confirmation of pregnancy. A hospital administrator, embarrassed and furious, produced the metadata. Timestamps, the user who had accessed the file, a username that matched a hospital employee who had been on Susan's payroll in an odd freelance capacity. When confronted with the web of invoices, transfers, and doctored files, Yvette's defenses crumbled. Her smile had always been a polished thing. Now it shivered. In her statement, under pressure and legal advisement, she pleaded a kind of manufactured desperation, saying that she had feared losing everything if she did not present a certain truth. It was not forgiveness, it was the public unraveling of what people do when they try to buy their way into a story. Ian's role in the scandal emerged like a bruise. He had been coaxed, edited, and filled with doubts until his choices seemed to belong to the people who had fed those doubts to him. In a private meeting with the legal team, and then publicly, Ian admitted his failure to stand by Stella and to ask questions when claims were made. His apology was awkward, human, a man who had been molded by other people's expectations finally speaking without filters. He wanted to make amends. Stella accepted the apology the way one accepts a small bandage, necessary for healing but not erasing the hurt. Justice, however, is not only apology and arrest. It is the way evidence becomes public and a lie loses traction. Ronan's legal team released the medical logs, the bank transfers, and the recorded conversations to a presiding judge in a careful cascade. The curator of the family's public narrative, the Sterling PR machine, tried to build a rebuttal, but it was too late. The underpinnings of the smear had been exposed. In the hush after the arrests, Stella slept. Exhaustion comes in layers. She had not realized how many until it folded her like a wave. In the morning, she stood at the manor's large window and watched the garden. The same hedges that had hidden men the week before, now trimmed and ordinary. She had been taken and returned. She had felt fear and kept her wits. She had not been passive. She had been the sort of person who leaves small traps that only someone paying attention would fall into. Ronan watched her quietly and then suggested something she had been avoiding, a public statement telling her version of the truth. She did not want attention spent on revenge, but she wanted clarity. They decided on simplicity, a short press release, a choice to present facts rather than a spectacle. Stella's voice, when recorded, was steady and not theatrical. "I will not be the punchline in someone else's story," she said. "I asked for my life to be measured by truth, not rumor. I have found that truth, and I will not trade it." The fallout reshaped the family. Susan Liu faced charges, and, among the wealthier circles that had once protected her, something like quiet condemnation. The Sterling name, which had been quick to refine itself into a brand of social polish, had to reckon with vulnerability. Some family members sought to rebuild with humility. Others retreated into defensive silence. Old alliances shifted, and new ones formed. People who had been indifferent found causes to adopt. People who had once tittered found reasons to be sincere. Stella's mother, whose hand had retreated at the banquet like a signal of turning away, arrived at the manor one gray afternoon with a small folded letter. She had watched the public unpeeling of lies and the slow, stubborn reassembling of a woman she had once cared for with a complicated love. The meeting between mother and daughter was careful, full of things unsaid and histories felt rather than narrated. Her mother apologized in small, practical ways, not with grand gestures, but with the steadiness of someone willing to listen and be present. They did not fix everything in a single speech. They instead did what healing often requires, small reconfigurations of attention, time, and space. It would have been too easy and too cruel to close the arc with only justice. The human heart resists simplistic wounds and neat stitches. Stella's revenge was not a shout. It was a methodical reclaiming. She reassembled the life pieces that mattered, her agency, her narrative, her place in the world. She did not seek to humiliate Yvette for the sake of spectacle. She allowed the law and social consequence to run their course, and instead focused on building something that would withstand rumor and force. In the weeks that followed, Ronan's presence shifted from protector to partner. The language between them grew less about rescue and more about a shared life. He invited her into decisions about how to present the heirloom, a piece that had once been an emblem of lineage and power.
She insisted it be placed in a public trust, not hidden as private property, but used as part of a foundation that celebrated history and gave back to communities who had been excluded from the circles of power she knew too well. The idea impressed him, a healing that was active and civic rather than a private trophy. There were practical things too. The bank accounts placed on hold were freed. The boutiques that had refused service were gently called back and told the truth. Some issued private notes of apology, others made anonymous gestures to repair a wrong. People who had laughed at the banquet were left with a quiet regret, some sincere and some performative. It was not the same thing as reciprocal suffering. It was something steadier, a reminder that the public image of a person is a fragile thing, and that kindness is a currency you never know when you'll need. Then, in the cool bloom of late spring, Ronan asked her to attend a smaller event than the wedding that had been stolen from her. It was a private breakfast at the manor, an early hour where the world felt unhurried and the light was clean. The staff had arranged a small table in the conservatory, a place where the air smelled of citrus and the sun warmed the leaves in a soothing hush. Ronan was there with a single envelope in his hand, a look on his face that mixed the old fierce care with something softer. "I promised you a fight where the right hands would win," he said. "We won a good part of it. There's more work to do, but—" He stopped, not out of lack of words, but out of respect for the fact that what was being offered needed consent, not only gratitude. Stella looked at him and saw, perhaps for the first time, the weight of a life that meant to be shared. She had been cautious with love because she had watched how quickly people used proximity as permission. She had been careful with power because she had seen how people's hunger could swallow others. But her caution was not a wall, it was a lens. "Ronan," she said, and the sound of her name in his mouth made both simpler. "I don't need a rescue that rewrites me. I need a partnership that listens." His hand found hers across the small table. The gesture was private and as public as a promise. He had the same gentleness and the same resolve. "Then we make sure it's a partnership," he said, "with all the paperwork and all the mundanities, with equal voices." They did, in a sense that felt deliberate and modern. The engagement that had been scarred and then reshaped into something cleaner became an agreement rooted in consent, transparency, and joint stewardship of the public legacy they both now inhabited. This time, there were no cameras watching to snatch a single bite of drama. This time, the couple invited a small circle into the news of their lives and asked for privacy while still being honest. But the world is not content to let privacy be sacred indefinitely.
The last act of public reckoning took place not in court, but in a quiet, effective hearing where Yvette and Susan faced the legal consequences of their choices, and where the Sterling family had to show it was willing to be accountable. Residency rights and social positions shifted. Yvette was forced into restitution and community service, her social shelf stripped of the glossy polish she had worn so carefully. Susan faced charges and then quietly removed herself from the circles that had once elevated her. The legal process was not theatrical, it was procedural and, in its own way, restorative. It had costs, which is how justice keeps a ledger. The day of the ceremony, small, intentional, standing in a city garden where early blooms trembled, was an echo of what had been and a promise of something new. Friends who had stood by Stella in the humiliation and then in the victory were there. Leo, who made the schedule look like art, some of Ronan's quietly loyal aides who had never made headlines, Stella's mother, present and a little trembling but steady, and Ian, who offered his face and a measured apology. They stood in a circle that felt deliberately human, not an audience to a spectacle, but a witness to a pair of people choosing each other. When they walked out at the end of the short ceremony, their hands found each other in a way that had nothing performative about it. The cameras that were present, few and trusted, caught it simply. Two hands clasped, fingers interlaced, sunlight warming skin that had learned to be brave. This image would make its way through social feeds later, but in the moment it was simply a seal between them. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and the public, that fickle jury that had once laughed, watched as dignity answered rumor with small, deliberate acts of tenderness. Stella's vow did not make promises of grand gestures, it promised presence. "I vow to keep myself whole," she said, voice steady. "I vow to speak truth and to listen. I vow to walk beside you, not behind you, and to use whatever blessing we have to do some good." Ronan's vow matched hers, practical, humble, resolute. He spoke of partnership and protection that did not suffocate, of stewardship that would not become ownership, of love that was careful not to be a chain. After the ceremony, in a garden full of the hum of people sharing small laughter and stories, Stella stepped away for a moment and found a quiet bench beneath an old tree. Ronan followed and sat beside her. She watched him watch the guests, his gaze measured not like a guardian, but like someone who had learned to be a companion. "You could have kept me safe in 1,000 silent ways," she said. He turned his face to her, the light laying lines of the day across his skin. "I could have," he said, "but safety without you in it would have been hollow." She smiled at him. "Then we keep building," she said. "We do it in public and in private. We do it honestly." He nodded. "With equal hands." They stood and walked through the small crowd hand in hand. There was a strange, soft justice in that simple image. Years of rumor and humiliation had been answered by one unremarkable human thing: partnership. The world that had once laughed now watched in a kind of reflective silence. Some people clapped, others murmured. It did not matter. The image had been reclaimed. In the weeks after the wedding, Stella and Ronan worked together to formalize the foundation they had envisioned.
The heirloom was moved to a public trust, managed by a panel that included historians, community leaders, and legal guardians whose job was to curate history and fund cultural initiatives. Ronan used his position not like an impenetrable shield, but as a useful instrument to redistribute power in small, concrete ways: scholarships, community programs, and open archives. Stella found a role that fit, not a trophy on an arm, but a director of programs who used the sensitivity of someone who had once been on the receiving end of rumor to ensure that no one's story would be erased. She built policies that required fact-checking before accusations went public, and set up a rapid response team for people who were targeted by social media storms. It was a practical vengeance against rumor, systems that valued truth. The social circle that had once shrunk away began to widen again with different contours. Some relationships healed, others did not. Ronan's family structure shifted into something less theatrical and more honest. Those who had conspired were no longer welcome in the same spaces, and the world made room for those who had the courage to be public and human. On a quiet afternoon, months later, Stella stood where she had once looked out at the garden and imagined a life she could not yet call hers. This time, the light was warm, the air steady. She held Ronan's hand, not as part of a photo op, but because she wanted to. She squeezed his fingers and felt the familiar solidity that had supported her in the storm. She had not become someone else through this ordeal. She had become more herself. They had been laughed at when she was dumped. The image of that banquet remained like a bruise, the sound of laughter a hollow memory. But it no longer defined her. The photograph of the two hands stepping out of the back seat that had shifted rumor into curiosity had been replaced by many images, small moments where partnership and kindness had replaced spectacle. In a life that had once been uprooted by rumor, Stella had found a way to set down roots. There was no clean, movie-style undoing of the past. The consequences ran long and slow. But there was justice, legal consequences for those who sought to profit from lies, structural change to prevent similar abuses, and a reclaimed dignity for a woman who had been reduced to a punchline and then reconstructed into a person with agency and voice.
At the end of the day, Ronan and Stella sat on the library couch, the afternoon light drawing long bands across the floor. He reached out and took her hand without ceremony, delighting in the normality of the gesture. She tuned into the rhythm of his fingers interlacing with hers. The motion felt like an affirmation that they would walk forward as equals, not as rescuer and rescued. "They laughed when I got dumped," Stella said softly, repeating the line that had once hung so cruelly over her life. "They did," Ronan agreed. She smiled. "But the next day," she paused, enjoying the small echo of triumph, "the next day I was holding hands with a billionaire." He laughed, low and private. "And you were not his trophy." "No," she said, "I was and am my own life." He kissed the top of her hand then, the gesture tender and consenting and completely ordinary. Outside, the world went on. Inside, two people built something deliberate: partnership, accountability, and love that grew from shared work more than from idealized rescue. If you loved Stella's comeback and want to see what they build next, subscribe for the next chapter, where power gets softer and justice gets louder.